Look at that, video number 2. I didn't think I'd make it this far. Coincidentally, our Polish pals over at CI Games also felt the exact same way back in 2011. According to an interview with the company's CEO and PR representative, their attempt to get themselves out of the grave they've been digging with all their shovelware was more successful than they could have ever imagined, with the first Sniper Ghost Warrior selling over 1.5 million units globally. Which I don't fucking know how, but okay. Despite its, predictably, poor reception, this was enough to convince CI that their AA venture was more or less working, so they used whatever forward momentum they managed to gain from their 2010 efforts and channeled it into today's topic, Sniper Ghost Warrior 2. This intro sucks. Starting with the story, it's predictably quite simple for the most part. You play as a sniper by the name of Cole Anderson, who, along with his spotter Diaz and a team of some other American soldiers, are tasked with securing a bioweapon stolen by some Russians. That's amusingly quite topical at the time of recording, to prevent it from falling into the hands of some fanatical jihad.
A hard-on for biological weaponry.
No, I didn't think the story could have become more cliched than the last one. However, I do actually want to give some credit where credit's due. I'm no expert, but for what it's worth, some of the writing in this game has its moments in my opinion. Compared to the first game's script reading and sounding like a sedated Ben Stein reading US Army field manuals, SGW2 having the good grace to have a handful of somewhat cleverly written lines and levity amidst all the stoic jargon was oddly refreshing to me. It's not even accidental humor.
$50 says you can't get those two with one shot.
That's a kill.
I bet the other one just got a heart attack, but have it your way.
I hope you brought some plastic, otherwise we're gonna have to glue $100 bills on those guns and wait till they get stripped apart.
Thanks, man. I'll you a beer.
Hey, I'm gonna hold you to that. He's defenseless. Gotta keep him covered. That's 2 beers you owe me. And that's 4. Make it a crate of beer.
It's obviously not on the level of, say, Chaos Theory,
Are you gonna say monkey?
and it still takes itself very seriously most of the time, but I'd be lying if I said these small moments didn't bring a smirk to my face. A burly American who wisecracks occasionally is still infinitely more entertaining and human than one that doesn't. On that subject, I also think some of the voice acting is worth a pat on the back, especially for a budget game. I don't know why, but as far as generic, normal white dude performances go, I really like Anderson's performance. He's by no means Max Payne, Garrett, nor Ironside Sam Fisher,
Monkey.
but I can't help but feel like his delivery is at least slightly above average.
Copy that, sir.
For starters, whenever he delivers a neutral line, I don't get the impression that the actor is simply reading off the script. It sounds natural.
I don't like you either, but we didn't come here to make friends. The sooner you get us to Vladik's camp, the sooner you collect your money and get back to your busy social life.
But what I feel makes him a little more special in my ears is all the subtleties in his tone and inflections with certain lines that make him feel like an actual person. Whenever he provides some of the aforementioned levity, you can practically hear his smirk.
You wanna do it? Good cop, bad cop? How about the old-fashioned way? 2 guys with guns. That'll work.
After breaking out of a prison cell and realizing how fucked he is, you can hear his exasperation and stress.
There's only 4 bullets in this piece. God damn it. Looks like it's up close and personal for now.
I think my favorite moment is when he's fed up with his CO shit, where he captures more sarcasm and contempt in one line than my whole review of the first game.
Duly noted.
What's that supposed to mean, Captain?
It means I'm fully aware of the mission objective, General. Just be sure to have a CSAR team standing by this time. I also intend to get our men, or secondary mission elements if you prefer, out of there, at all costs. 3-2 out.
I know it's strange to gush or maybe just spring a leak over a pretty good performance instead of an amazing one. But for an archetype who can either sound a bit flat or forced, if they even say anything at all, Anderson's actor did a refreshingly respectable job given the simple role. What do I know, though? I actually do have more I want to say about the story, so much for not focusing on them, right? But I think we both rather I finally address the damn game. Before I get into the graphics, I need to start with a quick disclaimer. For whatever reason, whether I'm recording with Shadowplay or taking a screenshot either through Steam or hitting print screen, the resulting footage and pictures look a lot brighter and washed out than what I was actually seeing while playing. The worst part is that I have no reliable way of proving it, so you're just gonna have to trust me on this. Whether or not this makes or breaks the graphics is up to you, but I thought it was worth mentioning. Also, I tried to get DirectX 11 working, but it just made the game crash on startup. And I'm not about to spend hours troubleshooting it! This time around, SGW2 has been achieved with none other than CryEngine 3, which unfortunately gives it competition stiffer than the person looking at it. Like before though, I'll try to assess it on its own merits and how it stands up against the first game. Compared to the old Chrome engine, it's like you finally cleared your foggy ass scope. It looks significantly cleaner and crisper this time around, and things just don't blend into each other, which is good for a game where you kinda need to be able to see. Textures are generally higher res across the board, and shadows look so much better without a doubt. You also have a much greater variety of environments, with a new location in each act of the main campaign. Act 1 puts you in the tropical jungles of the Philippines that almost make me feel the mosquitoes buzzing around me. Act 2 sends you to the oppressive and war-torn Sarajevo with a brown color palette that actually works due to its brevity and sepia-tone vibes that fit with the fact that it's a flashback. And Act 3 takes you to the mountains of Tibet, which I find to be the most appealing of them all due to the architecture and fresh, cool colors. And of course, there's something about the overall aesthetic of this version of the CryEngine that caresses my corneas in a way that I can't quite put into words. Overall, a nice step forward for CI. But keep in mind, this is their first time using this engine, so there are some pretty noticeable flaws in their efforts to wrangle this dang-fangled German engineering. The biggest flaw is the lighting at certain points, which makes it pretty clear that the game is less achieved and more you tried. There's plenty of moments where objects completely fail to cast shadows, moments where shadows completely fail to be cast on objects, or both. It stops the game's graphics from really feeling like they come together, and frankly, it's kinda ugly. The HUD has received a massive facelift, being much more informative and stylish. It has a really unique design that I don't think I've ever seen before. The wind bar and detection meter have also been improved tenfold, but I'll cover them in more detail when we get to sniping and stealth. There's two things I also want to mention concerning the controls. The first thing is that aiming is toggled rather than held, without any way to change it as far as I can tell from a quick Google search. I'm normally not a fan of this, but I kinda got used to it. While it makes the pistol feel weird, it's somewhat nice to have when you're trying to snipe. The second thing is a lot more annoying, and that's the standing up animation that causes a delay that completely stops you from moving when you stand up from a prone position. Granted, it isn't as bad as this shit, but it nevertheless adds a thin layer of clunk on something that's fairly smooth in general. One of the few good things about the first Sniper Ghost Warrior was, as it should have been, the sniping. To recap, it was perhaps a little too easy overall, with overpowered, easily spammed semi-auto rifles galore, wind that usually didn't interfere with your shots that much, and a slow-mo effect that allowed you to annihilate groups of enemies faster than your mom can get the camera. It's a bizarre power fantasy that turns you into Dio Brando using a sniper rifle. As for the sequel, I'm very pleased to report that the sniping has been overhauled and improved in nearly every possible facet, starting with, most importantly, the difficulty. You're not virtually superhuman anymore, but now you really feel like a marksman who's pretty stealthy and good at killing people. I wonder if there's a better way to word that. The first thing you'll notice about this game is that your arsenal is far more balanced. Perhaps taking notes from the previous game's DLC, your three main rifles, the MSR, the M24, and the Intervention, are all bolt action, forcing you to make every shot count due to your slow rate of fire. The two semi-automatics that are available have mostly been balanced out through scarcity, with the XM500 only being used in 3 missions for long-range sniping sections, and the Dragunov only being found on enemy snipers in places you can reach, which is fairly infrequent. Even when you get your hands on it, the hefty recoil makes spamming it a bad idea. Further balancing your rifles are the revamped ballistics, provided you're not dead to me. Like the first game, the ticks below the crosshair represent how much your shot will drop, but this time it's in 100-meter increments at the max zoom level of 9 for your main rifles and 16 for the XM500. There's a few outliers worth mentioning, however. When you use the latter in the second mission, this seems to change to about 300 meters per tick, and the Dragunov's reticle, like the last game, doesn't seem to have the bullet drop in mind. The biggest change as far as I'm concerned is that the wind has a much more noticeable effect on your trajectory. While it obviously won't make or break close range shots, a relatively strong breeze will easily knock a medium or long range shot off course if you're not careful. On the other hand, it's far more predictable this time. While Isla Trueno's winds were about as consistent as my self-esteem, SGW2's pick a speed and direction and stay there, only changing depending on where you look. Determining the deviation is also a bit less vague for the most part. The wind bar is divided into 5 sections on both sides, which mirrors the sections created by the ticks flanking your crosshairs. From what I can tell, provided you're at a long enough distance for the wind to really affect your shot, the amount the bar is filled up tells you where you have to aim along the horizontal axis, give or take. For example, in this clip, I'm aiming at a target about 420 meters away. The wind bar fills up just under 2 segments to the right, so I line him up just before the second large tick, and I nail him. There's a few more difficulty tweaks I've noticed when you hold your breath. Unlike most games, doing that only slows down your sway rather than stopping it. To make it more stable, you need to either crouch or go prone. In addition, provided you're playing on the only difficulty that matters, time doesn't slow down anymore. All of these iterations result in a much more challenging yet still satisfying sniping experience, especially when you consider how the game throws a lot more long-range engagements at you than ever before. Not only does sniping feel better in terms of gameplay, it's also been improved from an audio and visual standpoint. While I'm very sure that it'll spark debate over this, the 4 silenced rifles you come across have incredibly satisfying firing sounds for what they are. They all have a nice, pleasing punch along with a subtle squeak or whoosh, for lack of a better term, to highlight the speed of your shot, a massive step up from the meager mouse farts from the previous SGW. Meanwhile, the XM500 conversely has a loud, powerful metallic clang.
Send him to hell.
Another thing that I very much appreciate is being able to see the whole scope model when you aim, which frankly, I just think is a cool and immersive detail. This also comes with the added benefit of seeing your scope kick back upon pulling the trigger, further adding to how powerful they feel, some more than others though, as well as watching it move about as you cycle the bolt. Lastly, you can now see your shots when you fire, which makes the pause from the travel time feel less awkward, makes your kills feel more impactful, and it can help you determine how far off target you were if you miss. Another nice quality of life change I noticed is that now, walking, crouching, and crawling won't make your heart rate soar. On top of that, you're given a nice pair of thermal goggles, except for Mission 2 and all of Act 2 where you have night vision, which I see as an evolution of sorts of the highlight effect from the first game. This time it's diegetic and thus more immersive, instead of being some kind of odd superpower. Obviously, it's really handy for spotting obscured enemies at a distance, except you don't have to be scoped in and waste your breath like the last game. On the other hand, it's balanced out by the fact that it can make it harder to see the environment in your crosshairs unless they're green for the mission, and you can no longer see the round you fire. It also just looks pretty. You also have a pair of binoculars, but they're dumb, for lack of a better word. If you're playing the game correctly, they don't do anything to help your observation that your thermal vision and scope can't already do. Otherwise, they have the ability to take enemies on your HUD, which completely usurps the thermal vision. But at the same time, it still doesn't help you that much because they're already on the minimap on lower difficulties. I pretty much just ignored them. There are still a few small problems I have with the sniping. The first thing is that I've had a couple of odd instances where my shots just phased right through an enemy, not killing them. It's actually quite rare, it works 99% of the time, but it's absolutely worth mentioning. I've also had this happen. Secondly, while the wind bar works like a charm, the lines dividing it up get obscured as it's filled, which makes it a bit difficult to tell exactly how strong the wind is at a glance. I also find that the max zoom level of 9 for the silenced rifles is way too low. For reference, despite having far shorter engagements on average, the first game went up to 15. Finally, the bullet cams do nothing for me, and I was okay with the ones in the first game. While there's nothing wrong with the cinematography here, I think my main beef with them is that the sounds are anything but. They just sound so cheap and cartoony, from the woeful whooshing sound to the anemic blood splat. It's so off-putting that I only enable them to get clips for this part of the video. As an experiment, I switched out the sounds with SGW3s and the result is so much better, at least to me. So it's all on the sounds. But I think the biggest deal breaker here is this weird glitch that disables the motion blur after one plays. If you feel your face burning, that's me dropping my hottest napalm grade take related to games. I like motion blur. Overall, I believe that SGW2's sniping strikes the perfect balance between having a readable UI that nudges you in the right direction, but still being vague enough so that you actually need to think. I wouldn't say that it makes it straight up better than later entries, but it certainly gives it something different that I enjoy. Supported by suppressed rifles that don't feel like BB guns, it just feels really good. While the sniping went from decent to really good, the stealth went from barely functional to basically okay. Now you more or less feel like a ghost warrior. Just about every flaw that I complained about has been fixed, from the inconsistent A to the lack of communication to the player. It's hard to describe the detection as any more than exactly how you'd expect it to work. I actually feel like I understand the AI's tolerances for the most part. Any uncertainty came from hoping I was being sneaky enough, rather than hoping that the game wouldn't just break. I can sneak behind an enemy without worrying that they'll just 180 me for no reason, allowing me to perform the new melee takedowns. I said new melee takedowns. They don't look great at times, but it's a welcome addition. The only thing that seems consistently inconsistent is whether or not a missed shot will alert the whole group. I know it's weird for me to praise what's honestly a pretty typical and bare-bones stealth system at length, but that really goes to show how much better SGW2 feels compared to the first. Like I previously stated, the detection meter has seen major improvements. It's much more noticeable visually, being a brighter shade of red and taking up more space on the HUD. It beeps to draw your attention towards it, it tells you exactly what direction you're being spotted from, and it stops filling when you're back in a safe spot. If you put the guards on alert, it will pulse until they're all gone. It does everything it has to do, with my only issue being that it can be a bit troublesome to tell how much the meter is filled if it's pulsing, but it's far from a deal breaker. It's readable, intuitive, and avoiding detection pretty much works without a hitch. And to that fucking guy who's probably acting all smug and thinking to himself, well, what is he doing all these holy things to be good at self? I think there's a big difference between communicating just enough information to the players so they're not playing blind, and essentially having the game played for you. Again, take the sniping for instance. The crosshairs and win bar are the information the game gives you, but you still have to piece it together to determine the trajectory. The aim assist completely renders it moot. In this case, you're given a fair warning about an enemy, but it's still up to your timing, finesse, and judgment to stay undetected. Trust me, if these elements actually made stealth games play themselves, we wouldn't have people who totally suck at them. Naturally, there's still some weird stuff to be had. I've still had a few instances where I was spotted instantly, but at least that's the exception rather than an inconsistent rule. The biggest issue is that if you alert even one guard, there's a good chance that you'll alert everyone else without any time for you to react. I guess it's kind of fair enough depending on what you did, like perhaps a sniper spotted you or you killed a guy out in the open. However, a good example of this problem at its worst is in this clip. Here, I missed a point-blank shot for demonstrative purposes and totally not because I suck at games, and you can see my minimap pulsing and enemies swarming my position. You can also distract enemies now, but it's really limited. Shooting something like a radio or a bell will allow you to lure a guard, but I've only come across a handful of these opportunities throughout the whole campaign, with 2 of them being forced by the game to progress. There's no way to just pick a spot to lure someone like throwing a rock or whatever. The best way to sum up the stealth is that it's much easier to avoid detection in general, but any mistakes are in turn swiftly punished, which is at least better than just punishing you for existing. As for your CQC stealth tools, you only have a pistol this time, and I have a love-hate relationship with this thing. It feels a bit awkward to use because of the lower fire cap that's easy to oversample, and a pitiful firing sound that makes the mouse part sound like a jet engine. On the other hand, it's like the previous game's pistol and throwing knives had a baby. Seriously, beware the quiet ones. And if you're really feeling spicy, you can get away with something like this. If you've seen my video on the first game, you'll know that my biggest point of contention was the horrendous combat sections. In the interest of time, I'm gonna give it to you straight. There is none of that shit in this game. CI have embraced SGW's true identity of being a stealth sniping game and did away with the spunkgargleweewee, and I couldn't be happier. There are still escape sequences, but they're nowhere near as broken as before. So if you wanted me to rant about that, sorry to disappoint. Looking at what we've covered so far, SGW2 is a vast improvement over the last. It's got better sniping, better stealth, better graphics, better focus, better feel, better intro videos. It's the perfect sequel! So why did it score so poorly? And how the fuck did it perform worse? Unfortunately, a cursory scan on Metacritic reveals that despite all of the positive changes, CI still hasn't learned much about mission and level design in the intervening 3 years. Forget Simon Says at this point. Simon has now attached a Battle Royale style collar to your neck that will blow up if you dare step out of line. In nearly every mission, you're just kindly obeying the directions of NPCs, whether it's following them or telling you exactly who you have to shoot and when. There's such an absurdly low amount of agency in these parts, it makes the first game look like an immersive sim. Even when you're on your own, it's not on your own, with the maps basically being a corridor, sometimes quite literally. On average, a typical level in SGW2 boils down to corridor, shooting gallery, corridor, shooting gallery, corridor, shooting gallery. Seriously, if you want a much better example of a linear sniping game, at least in terms of the amount of agency and feeling of freedom, check out Sniper Elite V2. This design is uninspired, lazy, and sure as shit ain't bigger. It's just spunkgarglesneaky. And you know what the absolute worst fucking part is? I didn't hate it. In fact, I actually kinda liked it. I mean, sure, it gets awfully stale and scripted, there's hardly any agency, and I would never call this good level design, but as a whole, the main campaign is a weird, guilty pleasure. I haven't felt this conflicted about liking something, making me question who I am as a person since I first laid eyes on Angel Dust. Trust me, I am no stranger to guilty pleasures, and I'm able to pinpoint exactly what appeals to me not long after playing one. SGW2 isn't so easy. I have tried to wrestle with this gay spider demon of a game to really rationalize how on earth I actually found myself getting fairly consistent dopamine rushes and genuine enjoyment from this railroad. I utterly lambasted the first game's hand-holdy and linear stealth section, so how the fuck is my dumb idiot brain giving it all a pass? Surprisingly, I'm not even an outlier this time. SGW2 was CI's highest rated game on Steam until Contracts released in 2019, and even now, it still has the largest volume of positive reviews. So there has to be something that appealed to me and a lot of other people. I'll do my best to explain my enjoyment by listing some of the positives. Firstly, if my 1500 plus word section on sniping didn't make it clear, the sniping feels really good to me from the ballistics to the rifles themselves. While I'm not gonna try to argue that it turns all the shooting galleries into something more complex, because it doesn't, it does at least make them feel a little more rewarding and mentally stimulating, especially for long-range shots. In addition, the galleries are a lot more interesting, relatively speaking, when you're not told who to shoot, allowing you to observe an area yourself and figure out the best order and timing to clear it without raising an alarm. While calling these moments true freedom is like calling BioShock a good System Shock successor, I see them as simple puzzles that are undeniably satisfying to complete in my opinion. The closest thing the first game got to something like this was the spotter mission, which, if you recall correctly, was shit. Another kind of section that I enjoyed is what I like to call the pseudo-stealth encounters. Cropping up at least 3 times in Act 2, they involve putting you up against a group of enemies actively hunting you down in a small arena, for lack of a better term. Outgunned and outnumbered, you have to reposition and flank to line up accurate shots and avoid getting spotted in order to survive. I see this as an interesting test for the skills required for this kind of game set in a unique, somewhat dynamic, high-risk scenario, with the one in the second mission being the best. It's empowering, yet highlights your vulnerability. You can easily sneak around your enemies and neutralize them in a single shot, but the stark contrast in your rates of fire as well as your limited health can make mistakes pretty costly. The much more fair stealth mechanics make sections like this work. Enemies don't spot you instantly, and you know when you're at risk. I can totally imagine something like this being terrible and unfun in the first game. Oh wait, if you're gonna put a combat-oriented section into one of these games, this is definitely a good alternative to the typical death from above sniping section. I really wish the game used this formula more often to break up the galleries. There's also some concepts and ideas here that I like in theory, even if they're not executed very well. Taking the feeling of vulnerability and kicking it up another notch are the parts where you don't have your rifle. It's confiscated in Act 2 and dropped into enemy territory after a near-death experience in Act 3. The core issue with both of these is that they're both too linear with rather static enemy positions that barely pose a threat. The same can also be said about a particular section in a parking garage where you need to stay in the shadows, avoid the light, in order to get to a circuit breaker. However, all you really need to do is hug a wall more or less and you'll never be spotted. It's wasted potential, but I can't bring myself to be mad at CI for at least trying. One more reason why I think I enjoyed this game as much as I did is the atmosphere, which will likely be the most objectionable thing in this list. But I'm not kidding when I say the game has moments where the music and everything else come together to create genuine suspense and tension, even if what's actually happening is fairly mundane. Although the whole soundtrack is pretty generic, it's quite solid and does exactly what it needs to do. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the very last level, but that means I need to get back into the story. SGW2 makes a pretty interesting attempt to break away from the simple, burly American tale by adding a bit of character drama. In Act 2, you're sent back in time to Sarajevo, like I said before. With your spotter, Maddox, you're supposed to meet up with a CIA asset named Marinov to document the war crimes happening there, so NATO will take action. You're also explicitly told to not kill the Serbian commander Vladik. After you grab the pictures as per your mission objectives, Maddox gets pissed at the atrocities and decides to disobey direct orders and hunt down Vladik. Anderson initially chastises him for it, but after Maddox basically says nothing more than "do it," he ices him. They're then both betrayed by Marinov, allowing them to get captured by the Serbians. Once Anderson escapes his captors and makes his way to save Maddox, he learns that he and Marinov were both using him the whole time. Killing Vladik gave them full access to a stockpile of illegal weapons to sell on the black market. He's then ordered to kill him for his betrayal. At the end of the second level, it's revealed that Maddox is still alive and well, because that totally hasn't happened before, working alongside Marinov as a sniper ghost bodyguard, if you will. This leads to a sort of boss fight in the last level where Anderson and Diaz have to fight their way over to him while he shoots at them. It culminates in a final sniper duel where you have to play a game of Where's Waldo to dome him. From a gameplay standpoint, this is okay. While it's still very railroady, being pitted against the sniper for a final boss is something that I'm pretty sure no other sniping game has ever done before or since. The game sells the tense situation well enough, with the music, atmosphere, and Maddox mocking you over the radio in a somewhat charming B-movie-like fashion.
That's your new spotter, Cole? You look like a pencil pusher. So suck in that gut nice and tight. I don't want to blow a hole in you just yet.
It's at least leagues ahead of the total anticlimax of the last game. My biggest complaint is that finding Maddox is a little too hard. While I think it's acceptable to make the player find their opponent in a sniping duel, Maddox's rifle doesn't even make sounds when he shoots at you, nor is there any kind of muzzle flash or scope glint. Narratively, I think this all falls flat. If Maddox just being alive seems out of the blue, that's because it is. Now, I think this twist could have been acceptable if it was properly foreshadowed, but this one part in Act 1 is legitimately all the foreshadowing the game does.
Enemy sniper! Where's he shooting from?
Keller, I can't see him. Get to cover.
This is all we get, a single callout that's easily forgotten and lost in all the background noise. We do get a particularly dramatic scene of one of your guys getting shot in slow motion afterwards, which could have been Maddox, but it also could have been any of the other mooks on the ground, especially since he only got shot in the shoulder. If he was sniped, you think he would have gotten shot in the head to emphasize that. This incident isn't even brought up again until the intro cutscene of the last level.
Sir, but it's true. He must be the one who got us back at the hotel in the Philippines.
I know that foreshadowing should be subtle, but I think that if the clues you've left behind don't completely change the way you perceive the story on repeat viewings, or even just give you a feeling of, oh, I should have seen that, it just doesn't work. There's plenty of things they could have done in each act to improve this, even a little. 1. Instead of just calling out a sniper once and forgetting about it, why not have the red shirts panic as they comment on how they're being mowed down, and reference the incident every now and then to make sure it doesn't doesn't immediately slip from our memory. 2. Actually have Maddox demonstrate his sniping abilities in Act 2. He's just your spotter for those 3 missions, he relies on you to deal with faraway targets, and he's only seen using an assault rifle. He was apparently taught how to snipe by Anderson, but again, this isn't even mentioned until the last level while you're fighting him. Without this, even the most attentive of players won't even consider linking him to the ambush in the first act. 3. Build up to the encounter over the course of Act 3. It's the longest act, so you might as well use that time. Perhaps have a few encounters where he ambushes you without revealing his identity right away, or have some mooks allude to some special bodyguard Marinov has. Any kind of clues would have been better than just going, "He's alive, BT dubs, lol." Even if it was properly foreshadowed, however, the emotional aspects of having a friend betray you and being forced to shoot them are totally lost on me. And it's not because I'm dead inside. Side note, I do want to give Anderson's actor a bit more praise here because he nails the sadness in this line after you defeat Maddox.
I shouldn't have come this way. Uniform. Laser 3-2. Maddox is down. For good. We're headed for the baggage.
Frankly, I think the main issue here is that we're simply not given enough time to bond with him. He has a fair amount of personality, that personality being a very angry burly American with, like Anderson, pretty good voice acting that makes him stand out.
They won't allow another European genocide.
And how many more innocent people will die before those tea-sipping desk jockeys decide to do something about it?
So perhaps more missions and dialogue could have worked. There's a great example of a betrayal that really fucking hurt in Metro Last Light because you've had time to bond with a certain very likable character, so there's potential here. Despite the major flaws, I still at least admire the attempt to add a subplot like this to make the game more interesting. Maddox's betrayal and death isn't something that will haunt and depress you for a few days. But it's also not a 100GB manipulative dumpster fire that does everything to piss me off.
You'll get your fucking day, I swear.
Yeah, I know I said I don't focus on stories, but I want to at least try critiquing them if I feel like I can. I can't keep avoiding it after all. Let's face it though, I sounded like an idiot and you probably tuned me out or you just skipped it, so let's move on to the DLC. Like I mentioned earlier, SGW2 has one single player expansion called Siberian Strike. It's a prequel taking place 3 months before the main story, covering how the bioagent got into terrorist hands and how our burly Americans managed to track it back to the buyer. And I gotta admit, especially when compared to the base game, this DLC is kind of the tits. While calling it an open world experience is an extremely hyperbolic description, you're generally given a bit more freedom than the main campaign, with larger maps and no NPCs bossing you around for the most part. Even though it's not better late than never, it's better late than never. Despite releasing a mere 2 weeks after the base game, this new Arctic environment looks way better and is more atmospheric than most of what we originally got. The color palette perfectly captures the climate, from the deceptively serene blues, whites, and soft yellows of the first level to the desaturated, oppressive tones of the next two. The blowing snow also adds an extra layer to the temperature that makes you want to put on an extra layer. Bloom is tastefully and realistically used. Some surfaces are shiny and iced over. The CryEngine 3 tying it all together is the strongest it's ever been. If there were some mistakes, I either didn't notice them or they weren't that immersion breaking. It's genuinely great stuff that, in tandem with Anderson having no contact, really makes you feel like you're freezing your ass off, isolated in a harsh environment with no friends. Like how I feel during winter. As for the missions themselves, the first level seems to offer the most amount of freedom from my experience, ranging from more interestingly laid out shooting galleries where you have to decide who to shoot and when, to enemy checkpoints that have a few different paths and approaches. It's still a pretty linear affair overall that can be cynically boiled down into being a series of thick corridors, sometimes even having some unnecessary barricades and dead ends, rather than being something like SGW contracts, but I felt like I still had some degree of agency rather than just being a puppet on rails. It's a good first impression and my favorite of the bunch. The second level is, unfortunately, a bit more like the base game, having you cover Diaz from a vantage point while he calls out targets. It's not without some merit though. Some of the shots are pretty far away, which, like I said before, makes things a little more interesting. I think the highlight of this map is something that honestly should have appeared more frequently and is probably the best way to design a sniping section. At one point, you need to track a group of 5 soldiers before they find and kill Diaz. Instead of him telling you who to shoot, it's up to you to monitor all of their positions by yourself and figure out the best order and timing to kill them without raising an alarm. This actually feels like a true test of your sniping ability, with mistakes like missed shots, bad timing, or taking too long to determine the trajectory being punished with a mission failure. It may take a bit of trial and error at first, but honestly I felt like this was pretty fair. Overall, it's not the worst thing ever, but for a level in a DLC claiming to be open-ended, it's woefully out of place and is easily the weakest mission of the 3. The final level is more like the first in terms of open-endedness, being a few larger areas connected by some linear paths. It's an alright level for what it is, but the more confined areas are really small, and the 2 larger spaces, a military base and a worksite in front of a large tanker, feel like a missed opportunity. Despite their sheer size, there's only one point of entry or vantage point, which after experiencing Sniper Ghost Warrior 3 and contracts, feels really limiting. The worksite also seems to have super wonky detection for some reason, which gives me flashbacks of the first game. All in all, even though Siberian Strike is nowhere near as open-ended as it claims to be, it's still a worthy enough DLC. It has just enough agency to make it feel like a much more interesting and engaging experience than the main campaign, despite its short length and ever-present flaws. When you factor in the already good sniping and decent enough stealth, the result is something that I really don't feel too weird about enjoying this time. Like Angel Dust. Am I missing something? Probably not important. Sniper Ghost Warrior 2 still confuses me. It's nowhere near as good as the cult following on Steam would have you believe, but I couldn't bring myself to fully dislike its simplicity either like so many others, let alone roast it for minutes on end. When I first played this right after the last one in late 2019, I still kind of enjoyed it then, but I largely dismissed it as a case of me being so tainted by the first game that literally anything I played afterwards would feel like a masterpiece. But now, even after looking at it with a more critical eye and revealing not just flaws, but things that would normally be total deal breakers for me, I can't wholeheartedly say that I hate this game in the slightest because it absolutely has merits that stand on their own. The sniping feels great, the stealth is functional, the atmosphere is good, the writing has some charm, it didn't make me want to kill myself. It does the bare minimum with its level and mission design, but it also does the bare minimum to be moderately enjoyable. I wouldn't recommend this game to most people, but I wouldn't caution against it either. It's easily one of my biggest guilty pleasures, and if what you've seen intrigues you, then hey, maybe it could be one of yours as well. This outro sucks.